Nearly 11 years after NATO's military intervention to depose Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, Libya remains mired in a spiral of violence involving armed groups, sectarian and ethnic groups, and external interference that has plunged the country into complete chaos. Following the fall of Gaddafi, the North African country was divided between rival governments in the east and west, as well as multiple armed groups competing for quotas of power, control of the country, and its wealth. Gaddafi ruled Libya for 42 years, guiding the country to significant advances in social, political, and economic matters that were recognized and admired by many African and Arab nations at the time. Despite his controversial government, Gaddafi became an important figure in anti-imperialist struggles due to his stance, primarily against the United States and its policies in the Middle East. It is for this reason that his life and death became pivotal events in Libya and are key to understanding the current situation. The way Gaddafi was murdered infused the idea that it's okay to kill, that it's okay to storm places. It was a culture where the militias were empowered to strike against anyone they thought was linked to the regime. The country jumped into chaos after a rebellion and split into rival governments, one in the east, backed by military commander Khalifa Hifter, and another UN-supported administration in the capital of Tripoli, in the west. In the east is the House of Representatives, based in the cities of Tobruk and al-Bayda. This government is backed by the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, LAAF. This is a mix of former Gaddafi-era security personnel and more recent recruits, along with tribal militiamen, hardline Salafists, and foreign mercenaries, Russians from the Wagner Group, along with Chadian, Sudanese, and Syrian fighters. In the west is the Government of National Accord, based in the capital, Tripoli. This government, led by Fayez al-Sarraj, was recognized by the UN. Both sides have various ground, air and naval units, with Haftar having been backed by the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Russia and France, while his opponents have been supported by Turkey and Qatar. These two administrations are not the only ones vying for power and control in this oil-rich country. Several militias, mostly in the south, wield considerable influence. Many have tribal alliances. More than 3/4 of the country's oil is produced in the east. Of course, oil is Libya's main source of revenue, so there is resentment because those in the east believe they receive fewer resources than those in the west, despite their region being vastly more profitable. Minority groups such as the Tubu and Arab tribes are also fighting for control of cross-border smuggling routes in the south. Human traffickers from Africa wreak havoc on the region. Hifter and his forces launched an offensive to capture Tripoli in April 2019, backed by Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. His campaign came to an end after Turkey and Qatar increased their military support for the Tripoli government, sending hundreds of Turkish troops and thousands of Syrian mercenaries. Insecurity in Libya has harmed the economy, energy infrastructure has been repeatedly targeted, and has allowed designated groups, such as the Islamic State and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb (AQM), to capitalize on the resulting vacuum. Furthermore, it has aided the expansion of criminal networks, including those involved in human trafficking, drug smuggling, and kidnapping for ransom. Oil is the lifeblood of the Libyan economy, a legacy of Gaddafi's rentier state. During his reign, the country's oil wealth was primarily distributed through a bloated public sector. Today, the majority of the workforce is still employed by the state, and subsidized basic goods such as fuel and food. As a result, Libya's economy has suffered from low productivity and a lack of diversification. Since then, the economy has been battered by security and political unrest, disruptions in oil production, and a drop in global oil prices. Furthermore, the sharp depreciation of the Libyan dinar has fueled the growth of a shadow economy and contributed to inflation. More than 200,000 Libyans are still displaced across the country. Since 2011, the general population's living conditions, including access to clean drinking water and safe housing, have all deteriorated. 2/3 of Libya's population is under the age of 30, reflecting regional demographic trends. Libyan youth helped fuel the uprising against Gaddafi in 2011, and they have suffered as a result of the chaotic decade that has followed. Unemployment is a particular issue that makes young people vulnerable to recruitment by armed groups and criminal networks. During the years of conflict in Libya, universities and schools have suffered, and many young people's education has been severely disrupted. The use of drugs by young Libyans has increased. In recent years, an increasing number of people have taken smugglers' boats to Europe, citing a lack of opportunities at home. Addressing the numerous challenges that young people face should be a top priority for the new government. Libyans have voted in 3 national elections since Gaddafi's ouster, with parliamentary elections held in 2012 and 2014. In addition, a ballot was held in 2014 to elect a commission tasked with drafting the country's first post-Gaddafi constitution. Each election has seen lower turnout than the previous one, with only 630,000 people voting in the 2014 parliamentary elections, compared to 1.76 million 2 years before. This not only undermined the legitimacy of the resulting parliament, a key component of the power struggles that followed, but also raised the question of whether Libyans had grown tired of their democratic experiment. Turnout has also been affected by security concerns and boycotts by constituencies such as the non-Arab Amazigh minority overrepresentation. The UN-led formation of a transitional government in October 2020, with elections scheduled for December 24, 2021, following lengthy United Nations-sponsored talks aimed at ending a decade of conflict, Libya's new interim prime minister, Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh, was chosen. However, unexpected obstacles forced the vote to be postponed until June 2022. Bitter disputes over the laws governing the electoral process, as well as occasional infighting among armed groups, are among the challenges facing the elections. Controversial figures declaring runs for the presidency have further polarized the political scene in recent months. Among them are Khalifa Hifter, Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh, and Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi's son and one-time heir apparent. The vote's delay also threatens to create a power vacuum. Furthermore, the collapse of this process is likely to trigger political disintegration, including the emergence of rival governments and a credible risk of military escalation. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi is charged with war crimes during the rebellion that overthrew his father 11 years ago. Khalifa Hifter, who waged a destructive 14-month offensive on Tripoli, was rejected as a possible president by various armed factions and many people in western Libya. Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh, the interim prime minister, had promised not to stand for election as a condition of taking on a caretaker role. All these candidates have garnered significant political capital. However, as it stands, it is unlikely that all sides will agree to the conditions of an election process should any be considered eligible. Instead, the Electoral Commission should insist that all of these candidates be barred from running under their own electoral guidelines. The presence of these candidates on the electoral ballot, on the other hand, represents a significant challenge to the country's ability to move from a state of polarization to one of unity. How can such a polarized country progress if its new president has a name that a significant portion of the population despises? There is reason to believe that such a result would be ignored by certain political actors, rendering the election process ineffective. The Electoral Commission, the Parliament's Election Committee, and the fractured judiciary were unable to agree on a final list of eligible candidates because there was no clear agreement on the rules, let alone who would enforce them or adjudicate disputes. The majority of Libya is under the control of armed forces supporting rival candidates. There would almost certainly be claims of voter fraud or intimidation if there was no extensive independent monitoring. A disputed outcome could destabilize the peace process, much like the aftermath of the 2014 election, when warring factions supported opposing administrations. In December, the United Nations reported that 2.8 million Libyans had registered to vote. This is encouraging and demonstrates that the country has a strong desire for a democratic process and representation. It is now up to all actors, both domestic and international, to ensure that the next election yields better results and supports rather than undermines these democratic aspirations. Meanwhile, despite the incumbent administration's pledge not to cede power, Libya's East-based parliament approved a new government on February 10, 2022, threatening a fragile peace process and raising the risk of new conflict. Prime Minister-designate Fathi Bashagha presented his cabinet to the East-based House of Representatives during a live vote from Tobruk. The vote exacerbated a power struggle with Abdul Hamid al-Interim Dbeibou's administration, which was installed last year through a UN-supported process. It is likely to result in two parallel administrations, which could derail UN-led efforts to bring the war-torn country back together. The NATO invasion in 2011 resulted in an economically and socially stable Libya under Gaddafi versus a fragmented country without a government, devastated by attacks, bombings, and ongoing clashes. Many people now regret supporting that conclusion nearly a decade later. Thanks for watching. If you like this type of content, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more stories.